The more I talked with Gaurav, the more questions I had, and I needed some answers. So I decided to speak with someone else who was deeply familiar with Gaurav's story, Vicroia Kataoka, managing director at the Arkin Group, an intelligence firm based in New York City. She's been engaged by Gaurav to help him out of this mess. She learned a lot about Gaurav, not only in her work with him, but in the diligence the Arkin Group did in order to take Gaurav on as a client in the first place. One of the things that I've noticed about targeting is you can sort of do it almost in plain sight, and maybe it requires hiring some online trolls or bot farms or misinformation groups. So there is some cost.
I mean, it's a very low bar. It's that you can see just in cancel culture generally, and the maelstrom of the onset of this disinformation age. You can make almost any sort of allegation, and it's much easier to break something or someone than it is to defend yourself. And it is relatively low cost.
And more than one person that I've spoken with who's been through this said at some point they had suicidal thoughts. So in other words, you can make life so miserable for a person in other ways that it's like akin to murder, akin to taking them out, even if you didn't have someone pull a literal trigger.
Yeah. And the isolation that results from the campaign is in of itself a certain death.
So take me through what you've found, because when you first looked online, obviously you see the flurry of articles about him. At what point did you come to the conclusion, like, wow, this guy was really unfairly targeted? This is a case that I want to work on.
It took me a really long time, actually. So there is actually a very large ecosystem that is actually available to vet and validate Gaurav's version of what the logic of the partnership was. Once I had a better sense of that, then it was easier to say, but, well, what about this transaction? Well, what happened here? So it was all very in the weeds and rigorous based on executing something that really much is very much in line with the logic of the partnership. And then you see the timing where once they actually did this sort of mini audit to try to move things forward, there are a variety of irregularities that were discovered by Gaurav's team.
This is the crazy thing in this write-up, and this goes back to the other point that you made that I really want to dig in on, which is you said it took you a long time to figure this out. I also went over the story, and I have to admit that even the first time I read this story, my first inkling was, all right, well, there's some gray in this story. And the more I've looked into it, I sort of describe it as one of those old pictures that you were supposed to stare at, and then all of a sudden you would see a 3-dimensional image forming. And like, once you see it, you can't unsee it. Like, for you, he's a client. For me, he's the subject of like a podcast interview. Not everyone is going to have the time. And if you don't have time and serious acumen, right? Both of us, it took us both a long time. And I think about like the average reader, the average audience, the average person that sees the story is no way going to notice the subtlety. But once you see it, you kind of can't unsee it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the actual record speaks for itself. Gaurav Srivastava has pursued litigation, civil and criminal litigation, in a variety of different pertinent venues related to the business partnership, and his adversary has not, save for one litigation in Switzerland for fraud that the Swiss courts dismissed on the basis that the fraud itself was too fantastical to be believed.
The articles in the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times are so troubling, sort of once you've come around to, I think, what you and I have come to, which is all arrows point to one person being like entirely at fault here. You've gone through these articles. Like, just give me your, like, what are the biggest problems that you saw?
Well, so in defense of the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times, I think that they were brought an extremely curated and well-developed self-reinforcing narrative with corroborated sourcing and, a very, seemingly affable and sympathetic, protagonist who they themselves had reported on about his sanctionable activity. And so he came to them and said, I know you've done this reporting on me, but the truth is I have been defrauded by this fake spy. And when you talked earlier before about, the Vorsach of like staring at something and then all of a sudden seeing it, what they were presented with is a very shiny, like sexy fake spy story. I mean, it is masterful. It is extremely well resourced. The animus and the resources that were, brought to bear to do this, I think it is extraordinary and terrifying.
Terrifying is right, but the Wall Street Journal article and the Financial Times article seem so one-sided and skewed that it's just like, it's almost like, as I go back and look at the article, I'm like, how, when they're writing this, do they not see it? And as you pointed out, we're not talking about some like, some saint here. We're talking about someone who was trading in Russian oil at a time where Russia has to be like the least popular country in the West. And yet he gets this like incredible treatment.
So I think that there is this false narrative that goes on that he was duped, that he was this innocent, simple oil trader. She was a very well-informed, deeply experienced, extremely well-connected Russian oil trader. And I think that the facts of what he's done in the open source has been widely reported on by the FT, the Wall Street Journal, Public Eye, Reuters, and a lot of independent watchdog entities. And I think that is, I think it's more of a cautionary tale generally. Whoever gets to set the narrative first sets the cognitive bias. And the cognitive bias against Gaurav is so incredibly high now that, you talked about, the New York Post story or all of these things. It's not just lonely because you feel misunderstood. It's lonely because people do distance themselves from you. That they're, if you're some
online, if you're actual real world implications.
Looking at your donor list and you read the Wall Street Journal article, would you accept their donation?
No, not a chance.
I would put it on hold. I would say I would donate it to charity. It would be the reasonable thing to do. But then that's another story. And then what is that? It doesn't suggest that they've done like this independent due diligence of their donor. But it is another story that someone doesn't want to have anything to do with, this fake spy. The last thing I'd really like to say, just because I think it's an important point. I am concerned about the kind of statements that the adversary is making about Gaurav over the arc of this campaign. At first, it was a fake spy, and then it was, a fake, squatter, con man. And now it's a monster and an inhuman, non-human demon. And I find that these are very deliberate racist tropes. And I think it's worth pointing out because it appeals to the cognitive bias of most people reading these papers. We're all, sort of formed by that. And I think it just speaks to how incredibly well developed and expertly designed this disinformation campaign is.